What if I told you a Mexican mechanic built a Volkswagen Beetle engine that made 200 horsepower? Not with turbos, not with nitrous. Naturally aspirated. From an air-cooled flat 4 that Volkswagen swore couldn't reliably make more than 50. This is the story of Carlos Gonzalez, the VW dealer mechanic who proved Germany's finest engineers wrong and created one of the most legendary sleeper engines in automotive history. The impossibility of the 12-second bug. Picture this. It's 1968 in Mexico City, and a bright yellow Volkswagen Beetle pulls up to the local drag strip. The competition, the loud, proud American muscle car drivers, can't help but laugh. Stock Beetles are notorious for being slow, running 18-second quarter miles on a good day. The smart money is on anyone but the humble bug. The tree goes green. The little Beetle doesn't just launch. It explodes. The front wheels lift clean off the ground, hanging briefly in the air, a sight no one at that track had ever witnessed from a Volkswagen. Just 12.8 seconds later, the yellow insect crosses the finish line at 108 miles per hour. The crowd goes silent. That is physically impossible for a Beetle. But Carlos Gonzalez, a man working by day as a senior dealership mechanic, just made it happen. To understand the shockwave this event sent through the automotive world, we must first understand the limits that were supposed to be unbreakable. Germany the gospel according to Wolfsburg. The Volkswagen Beetle's air-cooled flat 4 engine was, in its own way, an engineering marvel of simplicity. Ferdinand Porsche designed it in the 1930s to be cheap, reliable, and easy to fix. By 1968, the largest factory version displaced 1,600 cubic centimeters and produced a modest 57 horsepower. Volkswagen's engineers in Wolfsburg, the undisputed high priests of this design, had calculated the absolute, final, theoretical limits of their creation. They had charts, data, and decades of research. Their gospel was clear. The magnesium crankcase couldn't handle more than 1,800 cubic centimeters without cracking. The cooling fins simply couldn't dissipate heat generated by more than 100 horsepower. A push beyond those limits, they warned, and you'd find molten aluminum where your pistons used to be. That's what they told everyone. And for years, the aftermarket obeyed. Carlos Gonzalez, however, worked as a senior mechanic at Volkswagen de Mexico's main dealership in Mexico City. By day, he serviced reliable Beetles for middle-class families. By night, he became a forensic engineer, studying every component of Ferdinand Porsche's design, looking not for limits, but for hidden potential. Hammer and wrench, challenging conventional wisdom. Gonzalez had been racing Beetles since 1965, and he'd grown deeply frustrated with the engine's limitations. While American muscle cars were pushing 400 horsepower from their big blocks, the best Beetle builders struggled to extract 80 horsepower from their tiny flat 4s. The conventional wisdom among VW tuners was a rigid formula: bore the cylinders slightly, from 85.5 mm to 88 mm, taking displacement to about 1,700 cubic centimeters, port and polish the heads minimally, install a hotter camshaft, and add dual carburetors. If you did everything right, you might see 75 or 80 horsepower. Any more aggressive modifications, and the engine would overheat within minutes. The cylinder head temperature would spike past $400°/circ/text F$. The exhaust valves would glow cherry red. The pistons would seize. Everyone knew the limits. But Gonzalez noticed something interesting while rebuilding countless engines. The crankcase itself was overbuilt. Volkswagen had used the same basic case design from the 1,100 cubic centimeters engines all the way up to 1,600 cubic centimeters. The main bearing saddles were massive. The case walls were thick magnesium alloy. There was room inside for a longer stroke crankshaft if someone could figure out how to make one. Chart increasing the impossible crankshaft. The stock VW crankshaft had a modest 69 mm stroke. Gonzalez calculated that he could increase that stroke to 82 mm, a full 13 mm longer, without the connecting rods crashing into the case walls. Combined with larger 92 mm pistons and cylinders, this would yield 2,180 cubic centimeters of displacement. But there was a crucial problem. Nobody made an 82 mm stroker crankshaft for the VW Flat 4. The aftermarket simply didn't believe it was possible. So, Gonzalez decided to make his own. Working with a local machine shop that specialized in agricultural equipment, not racing, Gonzalez designed a billet steel crankshaft with the 82mm stroke. The counterweights had to be completely reconfigured to clear the camshaft and oil pump. The rod journals needed special heat treatment to handle the increased leverage. The entire crankshaft had to be balanced to within half a gram to avoid instantly destroying the main bearings. It took 6 months and 14 prototypes before they got it right. Fire solving the thermal nightmare. Next came the cylinders and pistons, the key to solving the air-cooled engine's greatest enemy, heat. The stock VW cylinders were 85.5mm bore with cast iron sleeves pressed into aluminum cooling fins. Gonzalez sourced raw cylinder castings and had them bored to 92mm. But simply boring out the cylinders wasn't enough. The cooling fin area had to increase proportionally, or the engine would melt, proving the Germans right. Gonzalez's genius here was simple and exhaustive. He added extra cooling fins, specifying 36 fins per cylinder instead of the stock 24. Furthermore, each fin was machined 2mm deeper than stock. This process increased the total surface area available for cooling by over 40%. The pistons were custom-forged aluminum with a compression height shortened by 6mm to accommodate the longer stroke. The compression ratio was a conservative 8.5:1, necessary for reliability on the poor 80-octane Mexican pump gas of the late 1960s. But the real secret to the 200 horsepower lay in the cylinder heads. Dashing away the airflow revelation. The stock VW head flowed about 65 cfm, cubic feet per minute, at 0.500 valve lift. For comparison, a small block Chevy V8 head from the same era flowed around 185 cfm. Gonzalez knew that quadrupling the displacement wouldn't mean a thing if he couldn't get air in and out of the cylinders. He started with bare head castings and completely reworked the port design. The intake ports were opened from 28mm to 35mm. The exhaust ports went from 25mm to 32mm. But simply making the ports bigger would actually hurt performance by reducing air velocity. Gonzalez spent literally hundreds of hours with a die grinder, carefully reshaping the port floors and walls to maintain gas velocity while drastically increasing volume. The valve guides were narrowed from 11mm to 8mm to reduce obstruction. The combustion chambers were meticulously reshaped to unshroud the valves. The valves themselves were massive, custom-machined pieces. Intake valves grew from 35.5mm to a massive 42mm. Exhaust valves increased from 30mm to 37.5mm. These were enormous valves for a Beetle engine, requiring custom valve seats machined from copper beryllium, a material chosen for its superior heat dissipation. The valve springs were dual units, modified from a Porsche 911, of all places, to handle the immense pressures. Gear, the camshaft and the rocker arm trick. The camshaft was a custom billet piece with specifications that would make any engineer nervous. Lift was 0.560 inches on both intake and exhaust, compared to 0.350 stock. Duration was a massive $296 carat /circ dollar at 0.050 lift. This cam required solid lifters with $0.006 inch clearance that had to be adjusted every 500 miles. Pure race setup. But here is the final key to the astonishing horsepower. Gonzalez discovered that the stock VW rocker arm ratio was wrong. Volkswagen claimed a 1.1:1 ratio, but Gonzalez's measurements showed it was actually 1.03:1. By relocating the rocker shaft mounts and using longer rocker arms, he achieved a true 1.4:1 ratio. This meant the cam's 0.560 lobe lift translated to an unbelievable 0.784 inches of valve lift. Extraordinary for any engine, let alone an air-cooled Volkswagen. Rocket the dyno run. 203 HP exposed. The first complete 2,300 cubic centimeters engine, which Gonzalez always rounded up from the actual 2,180 cubic centimeters for marketing punch, was fired up in March 1969. The exhaust note was unlike anything heard from a Beetle. Instead of the characteristic putt-putt, it produced a deep, angry bark that rose to a shriek at high RPM. On an engine dyno borrowed from a diesel truck shop, It initially produced 168 horsepower at 6,800 revolutions per minute. After 3 months of relentless tuning, Gonzalez extracted a mind-blowing 203 horsepower at 7,200 revolutions per minute and 176 lb-ft of torque at 5,500 revolutions per minute. Let that sink in for a moment. A stock 1,600 cubic centimeters Beetle engine made 57 horsepower and 82 lb-ft of torque. Gonzalez's creation quadrupled the horsepower and more than doubled the torque from the same basic architecture. Germany, the German denial and the durability test. Volkswagen's reaction to the news of these Mexican super Beetles was swift and dismissive. When word reached Wolfsburg, VW's chief engineer, Heinrich Nordhoff, sent a technical team to investigate. Their report was damning. The modifications, they concluded, violated every principle of air-cooled engine design. The cylinder head temperatures would exceed $450 /circ. The crankcase would crack from the increased stroke leverage. The main bearings would fail within 1,000 miles. It was, they concluded, technically impossible for such an engine to survive. Gonzalez, coolly, invited the German engineers to witness a durability test. He installed one of his 2,300 cubic centimeters engines in a 1967 Beetle and drove it from Mexico City to Acapulco and back, an 800-mile round trip through grueling mountain passes in the summer heat. The car maintained a 75 miles per hour cruising speed, climbing grades that would slow a stock Beetle to 35 miles per hour. Upon return, they disassembled the engine. The bearings showed normal wear. The cylinder head temperature never exceeded $380 /circ/text F. The crankcase was intact. The Germans left without comment. Spider, the black cockroach and the American muscle. Word spread like wildfire through Mexico's racing community. Gonzalez's workshop became a pilgrimage site for serious Beetle racers. He couldn't build engines fast enough. A complete 2,300 cubic centimeter stroker cost 45,000 pesos, about $3,600 in 1970, when a new Beetle cost $1,800. Customers didn't care. They were winning races and setting records. The most famous Gonzalez-powered Beetle belonged to racer Miguel Santana. His 1963 sedan, painted flat black with zero exterior modifications, became known as La Cucaracha Negra, the Black Cockroach. At the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez, Mexico's premier racing facility, it consistently ran 12.8-second quarter miles. For perspective, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda with a 446 pack ran 13.5 seconds. A Boss 302 Mustang ran 14.3. The little Beetle was embarrassing American muscle. Gonzalez, however, wasn't satisfied with merely naturally aspirated power. In 1971, he began experimenting with forced induction. Not turbocharging, the technology was still primitive, but supercharging. He adapted a massive GMC 2-71 supercharger from a diesel bus. The blower was almost as big as the engine itself, mounted where the rear seat used to be, driven by a Gilmer belt from the crankshaft pulley. The engineering challenges were staggering. He had to design a dry sump oiling system, fabricate a custom billet aluminum intake, and completely redesign the fan shroud. With 8 psi of boost, the blown 2,300 cubic centimeters engine produced 315 horsepower. Think about that for a second. 315 horsepower from a Volkswagen Beetle engine. That is more than a contemporary Corvette 350, more than a Porsche 911S, from an engine architecture that Volkswagen insisted couldn't reliably exceed 100 horsepower. These blown engines required 110-octane race gas and needed rebuilding every 2,000 miles, but for drag racing, they were unbeatable. A supercharged Gonzalez Beetle could run 10.9 seconds at 121 miles per hour in the quarter mile. Balance scale, the cease and desist, and the global impact. Volkswagen's response evolved from denial to legal threats. In 1972, VW Mexico sent Gonzalez a cease and desist letter, claiming his modifications violated their patents and damaged their reputation. Gonzalez's lawyer responded with a simple, devastating question: which patents specifically were being violated? The stroker crankshaft was Gonzalez's design. The cylinder heads were modified from bare castings. The forced induction system used no VW parts whatsoever. Volkswagen quietly dropped the matter. By 1973, Gonzalez was shipping stroker kits worldwide. American VW racers had heard about these mythical Mexican engines through classified ads in Hot VW magazine. The first kit arrived in California in September 1973, ordered by Gene Berg himself, a legendary VW tuner. Berg was deeply skeptical. He'd been building VW engines for 15 years and had never exceeded 150 horsepower naturally aspirated. Berg assembled the kit with scientific precision. On his dyno, it produced 198 horsepower at 7,100 revolutions per minute. Berg immediately ordered 10 more kits. Within a year, Gonzalez stroker engines were dominating West Coast VW drag racing. The old guard of VW tuning had been overthrown by a single Mexican dealer mechanic. But here's the kicker. Gonzalez never patented his designs. When asked why, he simply said, "Knowledge should be free. If Volkswagen had shared their engineering freely, I wouldn't have needed to figure this out myself." By 1975, American companies were producing their own stroker cranks based on Gonzalez's specifications. The 82mm stroke became the standard for serious VW performance engines. Airplane, the aviation angle, and the ultimate validation. The technical impact went far beyond drag racing. Gonzalez's work inspired a generation of engineers to push beyond manufacturer limitations. Even Porsche engineers, who had always dismissed the Beetle engine as primitive, took notice. Several Gonzalez innovations, the deeper cooling fins, the revised rocker geometry, unofficially appeared in later Porsche engines. But the real revolution came from an unexpected source: aircraft. In 1979, an experimental aircraft builder named William Wynne approached Gonzalez. He needed absolute reliability for his home-built airplane. Aircraft engines cannot afford to fail. Gonzalez developed a special aircraft version of his 2,300 cubic centimeters engine. Lower compression, a milder cam with hydraulic lifters for maintenance-free operation, and a deep sump oiling system holding 8 quarts of oil. The aircraft engines were derated to 125 horsepower at 3,600 revolutions per minute for maximum reliability. Even at this conservative output, they transformed VW-powered aircraft. The 2,300 cubic centimeters strokers climbed at 1,200 feet per minute. Wynne's prototype flew from Florida to Alaska and back, 8,000 miles, without any engine maintenance beyond oil changes. The FAA refused to certify the modifications, but for experimental planes, the 2,300 cubic centimeters stroker became the gold standard. Today, hundreds of aircraft fly with Gonzalez design engines, logging millions of flight hours with a safety record that matches certified engines. Handshake the final irony. VW hires the enemy. Meanwhile, in racing, the engines kept evolving. In 1982, racer Juan Pablo Montoya, father of the famous Formula One driver, built a twin-engine Beetle dragster with 2 supercharged Gonzalez 2300s. Total output: 640 horsepower. The car ran 8.7 seconds at 154 miles per hour, making it one of the world's quickest Volkswagens. The economic impact in Mexico was significant. By 1985, Gonzalez's company, Mexibug Performance, employed 42 people and generated 120 million pesos annually. The Mexican government recognized Gonzalez with the National Prize for Technological Innovation. And then came the final, sweet irony. After years of denying his innovations were possible, Volkswagen hired him as a consultant. That's right. In 1986, VW brought Gonzalez to Wolfsburg. His real job was teaching German engineers what they'd missed about their own design. The lessons learned subtly influenced the Wasserboxer engine used in later VW vans.